Now, finally, in game number 5, we have Magnus Carlsen facing off against Wesley from the 2015 Cyclefeld Cup tournament. Now, in the game, Wesley obviously went for the Najdorf variation with a6, and our hero, Magnus Carlsen, as usual, goes bishop e3, the English attack. Now, once again, we're looking at more lines where black goes e5, lines we have not covered yet. You don't want to miss this game. In the game, black goes e5. Now, knight b3 from white, the standard move, bishop e6 and f3. Once again, the starting point for the e5 line in the English attack against the Najdorf. Now, so far, we've looked at lines where black goes h5, trying to stop the g4 advance from white. Also, ones where black goes bishop e7, short castles, and then the move a5, expanding on the queen side. Those two ideas are very common. However, there is a third idea. That is the very fast b5 advance from black, trying to counterplay on the queen side as quickly as possible. So here is a great example of that. In the game, Wesley goes knight b to d7, a good move. Now, Magnus Carlsen, queen d2. Of course, the move g4 immediately also possible in this position. It's really a matter of taste. I guess most moves, white is going to go queen d2 next. For example, at bishop e7, then queen d2 is the move. Same thing after h6, then queen d2 is the move from white. However, there are some differences. If black does go knight b6 here, believe it or not, he's threatening the move d5. He now has both of those knights defending that d5 square. With that in mind, here white needs to immediately knock off that knight off the f6 square where it is defending d5. For example, knight to h5, then queen d2. And finally, there's the immediate b5 advance from black here. In that case, white can do just about whatever he wants. Queen d2 is playable, as well as the immediate g5 and even the immediate a4. So overall, queen d2 from Magnus Carlsen, probably a safer move. However, g4 in this position also very playable for white. Now, queen d2 on the board. Again, in the prior two games, we saw h5 and bishop e7 ideas. Here instead, Wesley goes for the immediate expansion on the queen side with the move b5. Now here, right off the bat, we have to ask, is the move b4 from black a threat? And in this position, the answer is no. If that was the case, white would simply respond knight to d5, a move he very often wants to make in the English attack anyway, so that is not a big deal at all. With that in mind, here, Magnus Carlsen, long castles. Wesley goes bishop e7, very typical developing move. And now, of course, Magnus Carlsen starts the attack on the king side with that move g4 we talked about so much in this video. Now, of course, white's idea is g5, try to knock the knight off the f6 square, fighting for the d5 square, and potentially getting those king side pawns rolling down the board. Now, from here, black has a very, very big decision to make. The key moves for black are going to be short castles on the king side and the move b4. Now, in the game, black went b4, but this is the less common idea. More common in general is the move short castles, and I do want to very quickly cover the main ideas in this position. Here, white's best move is g5, knocking off the knight, and now black has a choice. He can either go knight to h5, or he can immediately counterattack on the queen side with the move b4, try to hit the knight on the c3 square. Now, in this position, the move knight to h5 is more solid. It's the recent favorite of Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, a big Najdorf specialist. We saw his game earlier in this video. And from here, white's plans are pretty simple. They typically involve moves like king to b1, rook g1, h4, maybe knight d5, just kind of playing all over the board with very typical moves we've seen throughout this video. However, if black goes for the alternative, b4, this is an absolutely notorious line. The theory here is very, very heavy. Now here, g takes f6 is definitely the simpler move. Then black's going to take the knight on the c3 square. It's the only way to not drop a piece. White responds queen takes c3. Black takes back on f6 with the knight. And then finally, white jumps in with his own knight to the a5 square, threatening knight to c6 ideas. So this line is pretty good for white. White is definitely fighting for an edge. However, the more complicated variation, if you're into that sort of thing, maybe you are, is definitely going to be the move knight to e2 in this position. From here, black typically goes knight to e8. And from there, it's pretty much an all-out attacking game with both sides trying to push their pawns down the board literally as fast as they possibly can. Here, the main line continues f4 from white, a5 for black, then f5, and finally a4. Here, white can go knight d4 or take on e6. The game is super, super complicated. Again, a typical English attack style position with attacking on opposite sides of the board. Now, heading way back, Instead of the move short castles on move 11, of course, Wesley So does go for b4 in this game. Now here, what are White's options? Well, as usual in this kind of position, the best move for White is going to be knight to d5. Now instead, knight e2 and knight a4 are technically playable, but they're not that great. If White goes knight to e2, then h6 from Black pretty much shuts down the idea of the g5 advance. And meanwhile, if White goes knight to a4 in this position, then Black can simply go rook to b8, defending the pawn on the b4 square, and overall he has a pretty good game in this position. I mean, just look at that knight on the e4 square. It's definitely out of play for right now. Now, instead of that, Magnus Carlsen does go for the move knight to d5 in this position right here. He definitely studied his English attack theory at some point. Knight d5 on the board. And now, of course, as usual, the threat is knight takes e7. If that bishop falls, then that d6 pawn will fall as well, as that bishop is the key defender of the pawn. For example, a5, then White simply goes knight takes e7. Then after queen takes d6, and White is up a clean pawn. You can't allow that as Black, so with that in mind, bishop takes d5 is the standard idea. Now, White takes back on d5, and in the game, Wesley So goes for a very strong move, knight to b6. Now, this is a very important move to be aware of. Here, with the knights on the b6 and the f6 squares, they're both fighting for that pawn on the d5 square. And of course, if Black takes a pawn, for example, king b1, then knight takes, obviously, White cannot take back the knight on the d5 square with the queen, because then the other knight would recapture back, so that is no good. So with that in mind, what else can White do in this position right here? He obviously can't really defend the pawn on d5. Bishop c4 is not possible, as the knight also controls that square. Well, winning the pawn on the b4 square is an option. Let's see how this one works out. Here, Black obviously can take on d5. Then the best move is actually bishop takes b6. You ignore the threat on your own queen by counterattacking on Black's queen. And then after knight takes b6, we have a roughly level game where both sides are doing pretty well. I mean, obviously, this knight on b3 is not that great of a piece, but neither is the knight on the b6 square, and overall, both sides are going to have decent chances here. Now, instead of this, in the game, Magnus Carlsen jumps forward with the knight to the a5 square. Knight to a5 on the board. And once again, this is a very common thematic idea in the English attack. The idea is the knight wants to jump into that very powerful c6 square. I mean, from c6, that knight is going to be an absolute monster, and there's pretty much no piece that can really challenge it. Both of Black's knights, the knight on f6 and on b6, are going to be very, very far away from the c6 square, and Black lacks a light squared bishop that he could normally use to win that knight. Now, in response here, Wesley So captures the pawn on d5 with the b knight. Obviously, both knight recaptures are both very, very playable. It doesn't make that big of a difference in the game. Now, knight b takes d5, and here, instead of knight to c6, which looks like the strongest idea to me, the most thematic, here Magnus Carlsen jumps back with the knight to the c4 square. So this is very puzzling. Real fast, the idea of knight c6, of course, is you fork both the queen and that pawn on the b4 square, and then you win it back with the knight. Instead, after knight to c4, that pawn is going to stand there on b4, and Magnus Carlsen, not only that, he's losing the bishop on the e3 square if Black wants it, and in the game, Wesley So does take it. Knight takes e3 on the board, then knight takes, and finally short castles. So here, the dust has settled a little bit. Black is up a pawn. He does have an extra central pawn. However, of course, White does have complete domination of this d5 square, and his attack on the king side is coming very fast with moves like h4 to h5, g5 to g6, and so on. So overall, White is down a pawn, yes, but he does have very strong compensation for it. Now from here, Magnus does have a few different options. g5 and h4, perfectly good ideas, but instead he takes control of the d5 square further with the move bishop to c4. Now, this is a very interesting move. From here, the bishop does a great job of controlling this diagonal, and it may even play a role in the defense of the queen side here. Now, Black from here, knight d7, getting out of the way of a future g5 advance. Perfectly fine idea. Magnus goes h4, technically sacrificing a pawn on h4. Of course, taking that pawn would be nearly suicide. Bishop takes h4, opens up the h-file way too much. That is simply way too dangerous for Black. So instead of that, a5 was the move from Black. Wesley So definitely knows his stuff here, and now Magnus g5 further expanding on the king side. Now Wesley So continues on the queen side, rook to c8, Magnus goes bishop d5, then knight b6, and king b1. So far so good. Both sides just kind of building up in the attack. Black queen c7, Magnus rook h to f1, And this is pretty much where we're hitting a boiling point. Both sides have most of their pieces on the most aggressive squares. It's very difficult for either side to make progress without pushing those pawns down the board at some point here, which means things are about to get very serious. All right, in the game, black takes the bishop on the d5 square. This turns out to be a mistake. Instead, the best move was queen to c5, just increasing the pressure on the bishop without committing to anything just yet. Now instead, knight takes d5 on the board. Now knight takes, and just look at the difference in the quality of these minor pieces. This knight alone literally gives more than enough compensation for that missing pawn. Meanwhile, this bishop on the e7 square is doing virtually nothing in this position. Now from here, of course, the queen on the c7 square is being attacked. Queen b7 is the move getting out of the attack, putting pressure on d5, and further setting up that future a4 and b3 advance. Now white here, Magnus immediately counterattacks on the king side with the move f4. This is going to be his key break in this game. And of course, the threat from here, if black doesn't take it seriously, is going to be f5 and then f6. And that pawn on the f6 square is going to force a massive concession from black. So of course, Wesley So sees this, and he responds. In the game, his move is f5. Now, this move f5 is relatively common in these e5 English attack structures for black. It's definitely not a bad move here. However, instead, the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack with his signature move f6 may have been a little bit stronger in the game. The idea is if white goes g6, trying to blow open the king side, black can go h6, and now from here, the king side is mostly blocked. Yes, the king is very vulnerable with this pawn acting as a wedge on the g6 square, but there's definitely no immediate breakthrough for white either. Now, instead of all this, f5 was played in the game. Of course, the drawback of this move is it does weaken the king side a little bit, particularly that pawn on the e5 square, and here Magnus simply eyes it with the queen. Queen to e3. Of course, the threat now is simply f takes e5, and then queen takes after black takes back with the pawn. So what is black going to do about this? Well, it turns out there isn't a whole lot black actually can do about this threat without further weakening his position. So, for example, here the engine likes the idea of simply a4, continuing the attack on the queen side, or instead rook to e8, preemptively defending the bishop and also aligning that rook with white's queen on the e3 square. So both of those moves were the best options. Instead, in the game, e4 is played from Wesley So, and this move is quite surprising. This was a classical game played in the Seinfeld Cup in 2015. Meaning Wesley So did theoretically have plenty of time to calculate the implications of this move. And now here the big problem is white can push the h-pawn, h5, and then h6, and if black ever goes g6, then literally all of these dark squares in the position are going to be so weak, and white's queen obviously has access to the d4 square, and now with that pawn on g5, black's bishop never has access to f6, so that queen is going to be an absolute monster on this long diagonal. So with that in mind, Magnus immediately expands on the king side with the key move h5, and of course the idea is you want to follow up with the further advance of the pawn to h6. Now again, white's obvious idea is to try and force out the move g6 from black, at which point this entire diagonal is going to be so weak for black. And unfortunately for Wesley So, he doesn't really have a good choice here. g6 was played in the move, and there weren't too many alternatives. Now, real fast, it may look like black can win the knight on the d5 square with the move rook takes d5. However, this move is not as strong as it looks at first. Now, if you like puzzles, this is yet another good time for a puzzle. Go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the right solution for a white. Try to figure out why rook takes d5 is not as strong as it looks like it is at first. Well, I hope you found a solution. The key move here for white obviously is going to be queen to b3. The idea is that rook on the d5 square is now pinned to the king, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems for black. Now, unfortunately for Wesley So, if this was what he played in the game, there's literally no way to defend that rook on d5. The best move for black is a4. Try to deflect the queen and otherwise getting your pawns rolling again, but then queen takes d5 virtually forces the queens to come off the board, and then after g takes and g takes, here white simply has a better endgame with the extra rook versus black's bishop. Now, heading back to the variation in the game, here, instead of rook takes d5, black goes g6. This was the idea we talked about, but now queen to b3 all the same, once again with that discovered attack on the king. And of course, now the threat is simply knight takes e7 with the double attack on the king from both the knight and the queen. That would be absolutely deadly. So obviously black here is going to defend that bishop in advance. Now, of course, knight takes e7 will be met by queen takes e7, and black's doing perfectly fine, so not a big deal. Now, here in the game, Magnus Carlsen takes a moment to try and lock down the queen side. He does that with the move a4. Very reasonable idea. Of course, not the only option. I could have also played rook to f2, preparing rook d2 ideas, or simply rook d4, setting up rook d1. But overall, a4, very interesting idea by Magnus Carlsen. You don't see it too often in the English attack. Now here, black, of course, the bishop is being attacked on the e7 square. Black decides that it's finally time to keep the bishop alive with the move bishop d8. Now, of course, knight takes e7 idea is no longer possible, but Magnus not too amused. He just continues rook d4, solid idea. Of course, the follow-up is rook f to d1, and that's what happens in the game. From here, Wesley So, king to f8, trying to get his king further away from the king side. That is just a danger zone with that pawn on h6, permanently controlling the g7 square. Now, Magnus, rook f d1, simple development. And here, black makes a little bit of a mistake. He goes rook to c6. Now, this move looks logical, simply supporting the pawn on that d6 square. However, if that was the goal, black probably should have played rook to d7 instead, from there supporting d6. So, what is the problem with rook to c6? The problem is very simple. This move blocks the queen's communication with the knight on the d5 square, and here Magnus Carlsen immediately takes advantage of that with the move knight to e3, and now the threat is simply queen to d5. From there, the rook would be pinned, and Magnus Carlsen will have a tremendous amount of pressure with maybe knight c4 coming after queen to d5. Now from here, black goes bishop to b6, putting the question to the rook on the d4 square. What are you going to do? And here Magnus, he ignores the threat and goes knight to c4. Okay, this is a very puzzling move. I mean, that pawn on the d6 square here is simply hanging. Magnus could take it. And then after rook takes, of course, the bishop is attacking the knight, but the knight is defended by the queen on the b3 square. Now, perhaps Magnus Carlsen didn't like this, as he wanted to try and keep some more pieces on the board. He liked his rooks a little better than black, so instead of that, knight c4 was the move. However, here, Wesley So has the resource queen to c7, putting pressure on the knight. And from there, Magnus would be forced to simply trade the knight for the bishop on b6, and black would be doing relatively okay. So, for example, queen c7, hitting the knight, forcing knight takes and queen takes. And here again, black has a decent position, but instead of queen to c7, Wesley So misses that idea. He does immediately take the rook, and he's basically falling right into Magnus Carlsen's trap in this position. Oh no, the sneaky Magnus Carlsen. Okay, that bishop on b6, it had to stay on b6 because it was guarding the a5 square. And now after bishop takes d4, the move from Magnus obviously is going to be knight takes a5, forking both the queen and the rook. Now, of course, the queen moves. White takes the rook on the c5 square, and now once again black has a choice. If you take the knight with the queen, then Magnus takes the bishop with the rook. This is tremendous for Magnus, believe it or not. So instead of that, bishop c5 is the move, trying to keep the bishop alive. However, after queen d5, we can see Magnus not only dominating these dark squares over here, but also the light squares over here on the queen side. So as we transition into more of the late middle game phase of this game, Magnus Carlsen's English attack is just looking to be too much for Wesley So to handle. Now here, Wesley, he does find a very important resource. That is the move e3, simply advancing the passed pawn, getting it one step closer to promoting. And on e3, it is very well supported by that bishop on c5. So very solid idea, but now Magnus a5. He's doing the same, simply advancing his advanced pass pawn on the queen side and knocking on the door of that queen. Now the queen has to move. Wesley So chooses queen to b5, not the best move. And here Magnus jumps into d8 with the knight targeting the rook. Now the rook swings over to the a7 square, knight to e6 from Magnus Carlsen, king goes to e8, and now the best idea for Magnus is you start by taking on the c5 square, and then almost no matter what black does, you go queen g8 check, and then win the pawn on h7 with check. So for example, queen takes c5, the best move, queen g8 check, king d7, queen takes h7, and from there you can further gobble up this pawn on the g6 square, and then just threaten to promote your pawn on h7 to h8. So this would have been the fastest way to victory for Magnus. Instead, he misses the idea. He retreats the knight back to the d4 square, and this does hit the queen, but here, Wesley So simply takes the pawn on a5, and actually threatens checkmate on the a1 square. So that one little mistake by Magnus, now Wesley So has some big threats in this game. Now Magnus queen g8 check, same idea we talked about earlier, forcing the king to the 7th rank, and then he simply takes the pawn on a7, king c8, and now, of course, taking on g6 is not possible because then queen to a1 is going to be checkmate. That's no good. So instead here, Magnus has to finesse the position a little bit. Here he goes queen g8 check, once again giving the king a little bit of a tickle there. Now king b7, and finally the move c3, offering that c2 square as a safe haven for the king in the event of queen to a1. Now, instead of queen a1, here black takes the pawn on the c3 square. Magnus drops back the bishop to b3, again checking the king, then queen to b6, and finally the queens come off the board. Queen takes, king takes, and then finally a few more trades. Magnus takes the pawn, black takes the knight, and white takes back the bishop with the rook. Now, in the end, we have this rook endgame, both sides having a rook and a whole bunch of pawns over here on the king side. And material may be even. However, the deciding factor in this position, of course, is that advanced protected pass pawn on the h-file. Stopping that pawn is going to be just an absolute nightmare for Wesley So. And here's the rest of the game. As usual, Magnus Carlsen just cleaning up in this position with his usual endgame technique. And in the end, that advanced pawn on h6 just gives black too much to worry about. Now black is losing the pawn on the g6 square. Of course, if king to f7, then Magnus simply goes rook to g7, winning the pawn on g6. And with two protected pass pawns on the king side, that is going to be all she wrote in this game. So for that reason, on move 56, Wesley So resides on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a series of games. All right, Chess YouTube, I genuinely hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it and loved it as much as I loved making it. And most of all, I hope you feel ready to use the English attack as white in your own online blitz games or even your over-the-board classical or blitz games if you're into that sort of thing. And as a side note, I play the English attack as white a lot against the Najdorf. To me, it's the most fun variation to play with those crazy opposite sides castling positions. And if you've never tried it, I highly recommend trying the English attack in your own games after watching this video. I think you'll agree it is a lot of fun. Now, if you enjoyed this video and got value out of this content, please give me some love. Smash that like button. Subscribe to my channel to get more videos just like this. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. And I will see you in the next video.